The eastern frontier of Europe is once again becoming the center of a geopolitical storm. Tensions between Russia and the European Union have escalated to a level not seen in decades, pushing diplomacy to the brink of collapse. What once were fragile diplomatic bridges between Moscow and Europe are now cracking under the weight of sanctions, accusations, and military preparations. The atmosphere is no longer one of negotiation but of confrontation. At the heart of this crisis lies a dramatic decision by the European Union. In what many analysts describe as the most aggressive political isolation strategy in modern European history, the EU has begun systematically banning Russian military personnel from entering the Schengen zone. This move is not a simple visa restriction. It represents a deliberate attempt to sever the personal, social, and logistical connections between Russian military networks and Europe. Ken Chian Tran 2. The implications are enormous. Russia has more than 900,000 active, reserve, and former soldiers. When their families and close relatives are included, millions of Russian citizens could effectively lose access to Europe. From the EU's perspective, this policy aims to cripple Russian intelligence operations, sabotage networks, and covert influence inside European borders. But from Moscow's point of view, this feels like something far more dangerous: the return of a new Iron Curtain. The fuse of this diplomatic explosion was first lit in the Baltic region. Estonia made the opening move by permanently banning hundreds of Russian soldiers who participated in the war in Ukraine. The decision quickly became a precedent. Soon other European countries began considering similar restrictions, transforming what started as a national decision into a continent-wide strategy. In Moscow, the reaction was immediate and furious. Russian leaders interpreted the bans not merely as political pressure but as a direct humiliation of the Russian state. The rhetoric from the Kremlin rapidly intensified, signaling that the crisis was moving beyond diplomatic language and towards something far more volatile. What makes this situation especially dangerous is that both sides are now operating under a mindset of strategic defense and preparation. Europe believes it must protect itself from Russian influence and potential aggression. Russia believes it is being surrounded, isolated, and pushed into a corner. And history has shown many times that when great powers feel cornered, the results can become unpredictable. But the diplomatic crisis is only the surface of the story. Beneath it lies a much more dangerous geographical fault line that could determine the future of Europe. To understand where this confrontation might explode, we need to look at one of the most strategically sensitive locations on the continent. Kaliningrad. A small piece of Russian territory, isolated from the mainland, but capable of igniting a war between NATO and Russia. To understand why the current crisis between Russia and Europe could become extremely dangerous, we must shift our attention to one small but incredibly strategic region on the map. That region is Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is a Russian exclave located between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic Sea. It is separated from mainland Russia by hundreds of kilometers of NATO territory. More than 500,000 Russian citizens live there, and the region functions as one of Moscow's most heavily militarized forward bases in Europe. What makes Kaliningrad so sensitive is that it sits like a dagger in the center of NATO's eastern flank. Ken Chian Tran 2. For Russia, Kaliningrad is not just another territory. It is a critical military stronghold that allows Moscow to project power deep into Europe. The region hosts advanced missile systems, naval facilities, radar stations, and air defense networks capable of covering large parts of the Baltic region. If conflict were ever to erupt between NATO and Russia, Kaliningrad would immediately become one of the most important battlegrounds. But today the situation surrounding Kaliningrad is becoming increasingly tense for another reason. The tightening restrictions imposed by European countries are slowly isolating the region. Border controls, visa bans, and logistical limitations are beginning to affect how people and goods move between Kaliningrad and the rest of Russia. This growing isolation has triggered serious concern inside the Kremlin. Russian officials fear that if the situation continues to escalate, Kaliningrad could effectively become cut off from mainland Russia. From Moscow's perspective, such a scenario would be unacceptable. That is why Vladimir Putin issued a very strong warning in late 2025. He stated clearly that Russia would not tolerate any threat to the security or accessibility of the Kaliningrad region. According to Putin, any attempt to isolate the territory could lead to an unprecedented escalation of the conflict. These words were not just political rhetoric. They were a signal. If Russia believes Kaliningrad is being suffocated or surrounded, Moscow may attempt to solve the problem by force. And this brings us to one of the most dangerous pieces of land in Europe. The Suwalki Corridor. This narrow strip of territory between Poland and Lithuania connects the Baltic states to the rest of NATO. At the same time, it separates Kaliningrad from Belarus, Russia's closest military ally in the region. Military strategists have long warned that this corridor is one of the most vulnerable points in the entire NATO alliance. If Russia ever attempted to break through this corridor in order to connect Kaliningrad with Belarus, it would immediately trigger a direct confrontation with NATO forces. And that would mean something the world has not seen in generations. A direct military clash between Russia and NATO. The moment that happens, the conflict would no longer be limited to regional tensions or diplomatic disputes. It would transform into a full-scale international crisis capable of reshaping global politics, security alliances, and the world economy. Right now, both sides are watching this region very closely. Because everyone understands that if the Kaliningrad question spirals out of control, Europe could find itself standing on the edge of a much larger war. But while Russia is warning about Kaliningrad, Europe is quietly preparing something massive on its borders. A defensive wall unlike anything built since the Cold War. As the tension around Kaliningrad continues to grow, Europe has not remained passive. Across the eastern edge of the continent, a massive wave of military preparation is quietly unfolding. Governments that once prioritized diplomacy and economic cooperation are now focusing on fortifications, troop expansion, and large-scale defensive systems. At the center of this transformation is Poland. For years, Poland has warned that Russia could become a direct military threat to Eastern Europe. The war in Ukraine reinforced these fears and pushed Warsaw to accelerate its long-term defense plans. Polish leaders now believe that if Russia were ever to move beyond Ukraine, Poland could be one of the first targets. Because of this concern, Poland has launched one of the most ambitious military expansion programs in modern European history. The government has announced plans to build a force of around 500,000 soldiers by 2039. This future military structure will include roughly 300,000 active troops and 200,000 reserve personnel ready to mobilize in case of a crisis. Ken Chien Tran 2. Even before this expansion is complete, Poland already has one of the largest armies within NATO. Thousands of professional soldiers, volunteers, and regional defense units form a force that continues to grow stronger each year. But the expansion of manpower is only one part of the strategy. At the same time, Poland is constructing an enormous defensive barrier along its eastern borders with Russia and Belarus. This project, known as the Eastern Shield, stretches nearly 700 kilometers. It is designed to slow down or completely stop any potential armored invasion coming from Kaliningrad or Belarus. Unlike traditional border fences, this system is built for modern warfare. Engineers are installing anti-tank trenches, reinforced bunkers, concrete obstacles, and massive structures known as dragon's teeth. These pyramid-shaped barriers are specifically designed to halt advancing tanks and armored vehicles. Ken Chien Tran 2. The goal of this defense system is not simply to block an invasion. Military planners intend to channel enemy forces into narrow corridors where they can be targeted and destroyed by defensive units. In other words, the strategy is to trap and eliminate invading forces rather than merely slow them down. But Poland's preparations do not stop there. One of the most controversial decisions made by the Polish government was withdrawing from the Ottawa Treaty, the international agreement that bans anti-personnel mines. By leaving the treaty, Poland gained the ability to rapidly deploy large minefields along its eastern borders. Officials have stated that, if necessary, the country could turn large sections of its frontier into heavily mined defensive zones within just 48 hours. This decision demonstrates how seriously Warsaw views the possibility of future conflict. And Poland is not alone in these preparations. Across the Baltic region, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are also building a coordinated defense system known as the Baltic Defense Line. This project aims to strengthen the entire 1.360-kilometer border separating NATO territory from Russia. Concrete bunkers, fortified shelters, and anti-tank obstacles are appearing across the region. In Lithuania, bridges near the border have already been prepared for demolition in the event of an invasion. Estonia is constructing hundreds of fortified positions along its frontier. Together, these efforts are forming a layered defensive barrier stretching across northern Europe. However, Europe understands that modern warfare is no longer fought only on land. Even as these walls rise across forests and fields, a completely different type of battlefield is emerging above them. In the skies, while Europe strengthens its land defenses with trenches, bunkers, and massive barriers, military planners know that modern warfare will not be decided only by tanks and infantry. The battlefield has evolved. Today, drones, artificial intelligence, and rapid response armored forces are becoming just as important as traditional fortifications. Across the Baltic region, a new defensive concept is emerging that many analysts call the drone wall. This project aims to build a continuous surveillance and interception network stretching along the borders of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. The system relies on AI-powered monitoring technologies, radar systems, autonomous drones, and rapid response units capable of detecting and destroying hostile drones before they can cross into NATO territory. Ken Chian Tran 2. The reason behind this project is clear. The war in Ukraine demonstrated how devastating large numbers of inexpensive drones can be on the battlefield. Swarms of small unmanned aircraft have the ability to overwhelm traditional air defenses, attack infrastructure, and destroy armored vehicles at a fraction of the cost of missiles. European defense planners fear that Russia could deploy the same tactics against NATO countries in the future. By creating a drone defense wall, the Baltic states hope to intercept these threats long before they reach major cities or military bases. But surveillance and drones alone cannot stop a large-scale invasion. That is why NATO has also positioned heavy armored forces just behind the eastern defense lines. Tanks from the United States and the United Kingdom are now stationed in strategic locations across the Baltic region. British Challenger 2 tanks and American Abrams tanks remain on standby only a short distance from potential flashpoints such as the Narva Corridor and the Suwalki Corridor. These locations are considered among the most dangerous points of contact between NATO and Russian forces. The strategy is simple but powerful. If any hostile force manages to break through the first defensive lines, NATO armored units can immediately launch counterattacks before the invading forces can advance deeper into Europe. Military exercises in the region have also increased dramatically. NATO troops are now regularly training in extreme winter conditions, operating in freezing temperatures and low visibility environments. These exercises simulate the harsh climate conditions that soldiers would face if a conflict erupted in Northern Europe. The message sent by these preparations is unmistakable. NATO wants to demonstrate that any attempt to challenge its eastern borders will be met with immediate and overwhelming resistance. However, while Europe and NATO strengthen their defenses, Russia is not standing still. On the other side of the border, Moscow has been assembling its own military forces at a pace that is causing serious concern among Western intelligence agencies. The buildup is especially visible in one particular location: Kaliningrad. This heavily militarized region is rapidly becoming one of the most armed territories in Europe. And the forces being deployed there are not only conventional weapons. Some of them carry nuclear capabilities. While Europe strengthens its defenses across the Baltic region, Russia has been quietly expanding its own military presence on the opposite side of the border. The scale and speed of these deployments have alarmed NATO analysts and defense planners across the continent. The most significant concentration of Russian forces is located in Kaliningrad. This isolated territory has long served as one of Moscow's most strategic military outposts in Europe. Today, It is becoming even more heavily fortified as tensions between Russia and the West continue to rise. Ken Chian Tran 2. Thousands of Russian soldiers are stationed in the region, supported by modern armored vehicles and advanced missile systems. Military reports suggest that nearly 30,000 troops are currently deployed there, along with hundreds of T-90 tanks and large quantities of heavy artillery. But the most concerning weapons are the Iskander missile systems. These mobile ballistic missiles are capable of carrying both conventional and nuclear warheads. From Kaliningrad, they can reach targets across much of Eastern Europe within minutes. For NATO countries in the Baltic region, this means that any conflict could escalate extremely quickly. The buildup does not stop at Kaliningrad. Along Russia's western frontier, particularly near Estonia and the Baltic states, additional military formations are being assembled. Intelligence reports suggest that tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have been deployed in areas such as Pskov and Karelia. New army corps are also being formed with the potential to push the total number of troops in the region beyond 100,000. What concerns NATO analysts is that these deployments appear designed for rapid offensive operations rather than purely defensive purposes. Military experts believe that Russia could attempt a strategy known as a shock offensive. In such a scenario, Russian forces would attempt to overwhelm the Baltic states within the first 48 hours of a conflict before large NATO reinforcements could arrive from Western Europe or North America. Speed would be the key factor. By striking quickly with armored divisions, missile attacks, and airborne forces, Russia could attempt to seize major cities before NATO's full defensive system becomes operational. This possibility has forced NATO commanders to rethink their entire strategy for defending the Baltic region. Because if the first days of a conflict are decisive, the balance of power could shift very quickly. And that is exactly why both sides are now positioning their forces like a loaded weapon waiting to be triggered. The situation resembles a hand grenade with the pin already pulled. One miscalculation, one border incident, one unexpected military movement. Any of these could ignite a confrontation between Russia and NATO that neither side truly wants but both are preparing for. Yet the battlefield of the future may not begin with tanks or missiles. Instead, the first attack might come through something far less visible. Cyber warfare. Energy networks collapsing. Communication systems shutting down. Entire cities suddenly losing power. The next phase of this conflict may begin not with explosions, but with silence. If a conflict between Russia and NATO ever begins, it may not start with tanks crossing borders or missiles lighting up the sky. Modern warfare has evolved far beyond traditional battlefields. In today's world, the first blow could come through invisible attacks on the systems that keep entire societies running. Cyber warfare has become one of the most powerful tools in geopolitical confrontation. Russia has already demonstrated its capabilities in this field during previous conflicts, particularly in Ukraine and in several cyber incidents that affected European infrastructure. Military analysts believe that if Moscow wanted to weaken Europe before any direct confrontation, the first targets would likely be energy networks, communication systems, transportation infrastructure, and financial institutions. Ken Chian Tran 2. Imagine a scenario where multiple European cities suddenly lose electricity at the same time. Airports lose control of air traffic systems. Banking networks freeze, preventing people from accessing money. Communication networks collapse, making it impossible for governments to coordinate emergency responses. Such an attack would not immediately destroy cities, but it could create chaos within hours. Modern societies rely on interconnected digital systems. Power grids, hospitals, railway networks, and logistics chains are all linked through digital infrastructure. If these systems are disrupted simultaneously, the impact could be devastating. Supply chains could stop functioning. Food deliveries could be delayed. Hospitals could lose access to critical data. Emergency services could struggle to coordinate responses. Within a very short period of time, millions of civilians could find themselves facing shortages, confusion, and fear. This type of hybrid warfare strategy allows a country to weaken its opponent without immediately triggering a full military response. by attacking infrastructure rather than territory. The aggressor creates instability while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. But cyber warfare is only one layer of the modern battlefield. Another critical vulnerability lies beneath the surface of the sea. Far below the waves of the Baltic Sea runs a network of cables and pipelines that form the hidden backbone of Europe's economy. These underwater systems carry internet traffic, electrical power, and energy resources between countries. And they are far more fragile than many people realize. If these underwater connections were damaged or sabotaged, the consequences could ripple across the entire continent. Financial markets could slow down or even halt. Communication networks could become unstable. Energy supply routes could be disrupted. Europe might not collapse instantly, but within hours the economic and social consequences would become impossible to ignore. This raises an important question. Could the Baltic Sea itself become the next battlefield in the growing confrontation between Russia and the West? Because while many people believe NATO now dominates the Baltic region, the reality beneath the water tells a very different story. If a conflict between Russia and NATO ever begins, it may not start with tanks crossing borders or missiles lighting up the sky. Modern warfare has evolved far beyond traditional battlefields. In today's world, the first blow could come through invisible attacks on the systems that keep entire societies running. Cyber warfare has become one of the most powerful tools in geopolitical confrontation. Russia has already demonstrated its capabilities in this field during previous conflicts, particularly in Ukraine and in several cyber incidents that affected European infrastructure. Military analysts believe that if Moscow wanted to weaken Europe before any direct confrontation, the first targets would likely be energy networks, communication systems, transportation infrastructure, and financial institutions. Ken Chien Tran 2. Imagine a scenario where multiple European cities suddenly lose electricity at the same time. Airports lose control of air traffic systems. Banking networks freeze, preventing people from accessing money. Communication networks collapse, making it impossible for governments to coordinate emergency responses. Such an attack would not immediately destroy cities, but it could create chaos within hours. Modern societies rely on interconnected digital systems. Power grids, hospitals, railway networks, and logistics chains are all linked through digital infrastructure. If these systems are disrupted simultaneously, the impact could be devastating. Supply chains could stop functioning. Food deliveries could be delayed. Hospitals could lose access to critical data. Emergency services could struggle to coordinate responses. Within a very short period of time, millions of civilians could find themselves facing shortages, confusion, and fear. This type of hybrid warfare strategy allows a country to weaken its opponent without immediately triggering a full military response. By attacking infrastructure rather than territory, the aggressor creates instability while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. But cyber warfare is only one layer of the modern battlefield. Another critical vulnerability lies beneath the surface of the sea. Far below the waves of the Baltic Sea runs a network of cables and pipelines that form the hidden backbone of Europe's economy. These underwater systems carry internet traffic, electrical power, and energy resources between countries. And they are far more fragile than many people realize. If these underwater connections were damaged or sabotaged, the consequences could ripple across the entire continent. Financial markets could slow down or even halt. Communication networks could become unstable. Energy supply routes could be disrupted. Europe might not collapse instantly, but within hours the economic and social consequences would become impossible to ignore. This raises an important question. Could the Baltic Sea itself become the next battlefield in the growing confrontation between Russia and the West? Because while many people believe NATO now dominates the Baltic region, the reality beneath the water tells a very different story. Many observers believe that the Baltic Sea has effectively become a NATO-controlled region after Finland and Sweden joined the alliance. At first glance, this assumption seems logical. NATO now surrounds most of the Baltic coastline, and its naval and air presence in the area has grown significantly. However, the reality beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea is far more complicated. This region remains one of the most fragile and strategically sensitive areas in Europe. The Baltic is not simply a body of water separating countries. It is a critical corridor through which enormous amounts of Europe's communication and energy infrastructure pass every day. Ken Chian Tran 2. Running across the seabed are thousands of kilometers of submarine data cables that carry internet traffic between European nations and the rest of the world. Alongside these cables are energy connections, including electrical transmission lines and pipelines that help distribute gas and other resources across the continent. These underwater networks are essential for modern life. If they were damaged or destroyed, the consequences could spread rapidly across Europe. Financial transactions could slow down. Communication networks could become unstable. Entire industries that depend on constant digital connectivity could face severe disruption. What makes the situation even more concerning is that protecting these underwater systems is extremely difficult. Unlike land-based infrastructure, cables and pipelines on the seabed are scattered across vast areas of ocean floor. Monitoring every kilometer continuously is nearly impossible. Even a small sabotage operation carried out by specialized vessels or underwater drones could cause serious damage. For years, intelligence agencies have been watching suspicious activities in the Baltic and North Sea. Russian research ships and specialized vessels have repeatedly appeared near critical underwater cables and infrastructure routes. One example often mentioned by security analysts is the presence of Russian research vessels similar to the Yantar class. These ships are officially described as oceanographic research vessels, but they possess advanced equipment capable of deep-sea operations. Some experts believe that these ships may also be used to map underwater infrastructure such as communication cables and pipelines. Western intelligence agencies have monitored these movements closely, suspecting that detailed mapping of undersea infrastructure could be preparation for potential sabotage operations in the future. But Europe is not ignoring these risks. Several countries bordering the Baltic Sea have begun strengthening their cooperation to monitor and protect underwater infrastructure. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have created a joint maritime surveillance framework designed to track suspicious vessel movements and share intelligence information in real time. NATO has also increased the presence of naval patrols and specialized task groups tasked with protecting submarine cables and energy pipelines. New underwater sensors and acoustic monitoring systems are being deployed to detect unusual activity on the seabed. Even civilian infrastructure projects such as offshore wind farms are now being integrated into broader security monitoring networks. Despite these efforts, the Baltic Sea remains one of the most vulnerable strategic environments in Europe. And Russia still maintains a powerful presence in the region. But the risks in the Baltic Sea are not limited to covert sabotage or underwater infrastructure. Another threat is quietly moving through these waters. Hundreds of aging oil tankers operating under Russia's so-called shadow fleet. And their presence could create a completely different kind of disaster. While military deployments and cyber threats dominate headlines, another quieter but extremely dangerous strategy is unfolding across the Baltic Sea. This strategy involves what many analysts now call Russia's shadow fleet. After Western sanctions restricted Russian oil exports, Moscow began relying on a large network of aging oil tankers operating outside traditional international regulations. Many of these ships are old, poorly insured, and operate with their tracking systems turned off while moving through European waters. Ken Chian Tran 2. Reports suggest that more than 400 of these vessels are currently involved in transporting Russian oil through the Baltic region. By turning off their transponders, the ships become far harder to track, allowing them to bypass sanctions and continue exporting massive quantities of crude oil to global markets. But the danger of this shadow fleet goes far beyond sanctions evasion. Most of these ships are decades old and operate without proper international insurance coverage. If even one of them were to suffer a serious accident in the narrow and heavily trafficked waterways of the Baltic Sea, the environmental consequences could be catastrophic. The Baltic is one of the most enclosed seas in the world. Its waters circulate slowly, meaning pollution can remain trapped for long periods of time. A major oil spill could devastate marine ecosystems, destroy fishing industries, and damage coastal tourism across several European countries. The economic consequences could reach billions of euros. Countries such as Denmark, Sweden, Finland, and Germany rely heavily on the Baltic for maritime trade, tourism, and fishing. A large-scale ecological disaster would not only damage the environment but also disrupt economic activity throughout the region. Security experts also warn that these ships could potentially serve other purposes. Because many of them operate outside strict monitoring systems, they could theoretically be used for intelligence operations, covert transport of equipment, or even as platforms for sabotage missions targeting underwater infrastructure. Whether or not these scenarios ever occur, the mere presence of such a large unregulated fleet moving through sensitive maritime corridors creates enormous uncertainty. And uncertainty itself is a powerful strategic tool. By combining cyber threats, military pressure, covert maritime activities, and economic disruption, Russia has the ability to challenge Europe in ways that do not necessarily trigger a direct military response. This type of strategy is often referred to as hybrid warfare. Instead of a single decisive attack, hybrid warfare slowly destabilizes an opponent through multiple overlapping pressures. Cyber attacks, energy manipulation, economic disruption, covert operations, political intimidation. All of these elements can operate simultaneously, creating constant tension without crossing the clear line that would trigger a full military confrontation. Europe is aware of these risks and has begun strengthening its defenses across many sectors. Military forces are expanding, intelligence cooperation is increasing, and new monitoring systems are being deployed both on land and at sea. Yet the central question remains unresolved. Will all these preparations be enough to prevent a direct confrontation between Russia and the West? Because in the current situation, both sides are building walls, mobilizing forces, and preparing for scenarios that could reshape the entire geopolitical map. And history shows that when rival powers reach this level of tension, the future often depends on a single unpredictable moment. The world is now watching the Baltic region very closely, because what happens there may determine the next chapter of global security. End of script.